The dying embers of what had once been the thriving village of San Miguel cast long shadows across the desert floor, their feeble glow barely enough to illuminate the faces of the 37 survivors who huddled together in what remained of the central plaza. Tom Flint Callahan crouched behind the shattered remains of the old Mission Bell Tower, his weathered hands gripping a Winchester rifle that had seen better days, listening to the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats that meant their time was finally running out. 3 days. That's how long they had held out against Rodrigo Vasquez and his army of bandits, cutthroats, and mercenaries who had swept down from the Sierra Madre like a plague of locusts, burning everything in their path and leaving nothing but death and desolation behind. 3 days of desperate fighting, of rationing ammunition that was already too scarce, of watching good people die, defending a place that probably wasn't worth defending anymore. The village had been dying long before Vasquez arrived. Drought had killed the crops 2 years running. The ancient well had begun to fail, and the silver mine that had once provided modest prosperity had played out completely. Most of the young people had already left for opportunities that existed only in their dreams, and the distant cities that promised fortune to those brave enough to seek it. What remained was a collection of stubborn souls who refused to abandon the only home they had ever known, even when that home had become little more than adobe walls, fading memories, and the kind of desperate poverty that made dignity a luxury few could afford. Tom himself had no particular reason to be here, except that sometimes a man made promises that were bigger than common sense. And sometimes those promises were the only things that separated him from the animals that roamed the desert wastes. He had given his word to Father Miguel Hernandez that he would help protect the village's evacuation route, a simple job that should have taken a few days at most and paid enough to keep him in supplies for a month. But evacuation required somewhere to evacuate to, and the nearest army post was 200 miles away across desert that would kill half the survivors before they reached safety, assuming they could even make it past the bands of Comancheros and other predators who haunted the empty spaces between civilization and chaos. So they had stayed and fought, turning the village into a fortress and themselves into soldiers, holding out against impossible odds for reasons that had more to do with stubborn pride than tactical wisdom. They had made Vasquez pay for every building, every street, every inch of ground, extracting a price in blood that would have broken a less determined enemy. But payment in blood was not enough to stop a man who had more killers than they had bullets, more patience than they had food, and the kind of absolute ruthlessness that came from years of taking whatever he wanted simply because he was strong enough to take it. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the harsh laughter of men who knew that victory was within their grasp and were already planning how to celebrate their conquest. Tom estimated at least 50 riders in this final assault, probably more, coming to finish what they had started 3 days ago when they first appeared on the horizon like harbingers of the apocalypse. Against them stood 37 exhausted defenders with maybe 24 rounds of ammunition total, and the kind of determination that was admirable right up until the moment it got you killed in ways that would make angels weep. "Senor Callahan," whispered Maria Santos, an old woman who had lost 3 sons in the defense of the village, but still clutched a rusty pistol with hands that shook from age and grief rather than fear. "They come again. What do we do now?" Tom looked around at the faces that surrounded him in the flickering firelight, seeing fear and exhaustion and a courage that broke his heart because he knew how this was going to end. Children who should have been playing with toys instead held makeshift weapons crafted from kitchen knives and farming tools. Women who should have been tending gardens and raising families instead prepared for a last stand that would accomplish nothing except adding their names to a list of the forgotten dead that grew longer every day in this harsh and unforgiving land. "We make them pay," Tom said quietly, though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth and rang hollow even to his own ears. We make them remember that free people don't go gentle into that good night. But even as he spoke, Tom's eyes were drawn to the ancient signal fire platform that stood on the highest point of the mesa overlooking the village. It was a relic from older times, built by people whose names had been forgotten, but whose need to communicate across vast distances had outlasted their civilization by centuries. The platform had not been used in living memory, but Tom remembered the stories Father Miguel had told about the old days, when fires lit on that platform could be seen for 50 miles in any direction, carrying messages of war and peace, celebration and mourning, hope and despair across the endless expanse of the high desert, 50 miles, far enough to reach the territory of the Mescalero Apache, a people who had no love for Mexican bandits and even less tolerance for the kind of wholesale slaughter that Vasquez specialized in. The Apache were not friends of the village. They were not friends of any settlement, really, but they were enemies of chaos and cruelty, and sometimes the enemy of your enemy was the only ally you could find when the world had gone mad and civilization had shown its true face. It was a desperate plan, probably suicidal, and certainly foolish by any reasonable standard. But Tom had spent enough time in desperate situations to know that foolish plans sometimes work precisely because they were too crazy for a rational enemy to anticipate, too unexpected for conventional military thinking to counter effectively. "Maria," Tom said quietly, his voice barely audible above the growing sound of approaching horses. "Can you still handle that old pistol?" The old woman's eyes flashed with something that might have been humor, though it was hard to tell in the dancing shadows cast by the dying fires. "Better than you can handle flattery, young man. Why do you ask such a question at a time like this?" "Because I need someone to keep these people together for about an hour, maybe 2 if we're lucky. Can you do that?" Maria looked around at the survivors, then back at Tom, with eyes that had seen too much suffering, but had not yet given up hope entirely. "Where are you going, Senor Callahan? Surely you do not think to abandon us now when the end is so close?" Tom pointed toward the signal fire platform, barely visible in the darkness above them, like some ancient altar waiting for the right sacrifice. "To light a fire that might save us all or get us killed a little bit faster. Either way, it's better than waiting here to die like sheep in a pen." The old woman nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without the need for further explanation. She had lived long enough to recognize desperation when she saw it, and wise enough to know that desperate times called for desperate measures, even when those measures defied logic and common sense. "Go then," Maria said, her voice steady despite the terror that lurked behind her eyes. "We will hold them as long as we can. May God watch over you and guide your steps." Tom gathered what he needed quickly: matches wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture, kindling made from the driest wood he could find, and a bottle of lamp oil that might help the fire catch and burn bright enough to be seen across the vast emptiness of the desert. The climb to the platform would take him away from the defenders at the worst possible moment, when every rifle was needed and every second counted. But staying would only add one more gun to a fight they couldn't win anyway. The path up the mesa was treacherous in the darkness, a narrow trail that had been carved into the rock by generations of feet, but had been neglected for decades as the old ways gave way to new ones. Tom moved as quickly as he dared, using his hands as much as his feet to navigate the treacherous route, feeling loose stones scatter away beneath him as he climbed toward the ancient platform that represented their only hope of salvation. Behind him, the sound of gunfire erupted as Vasquez's men began their final assault, the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper boom of shotguns echoing off the canyon walls like thunder in a desert storm. Tom could hear the distinctive whine of bullets ricocheting off stone, the desperate shouts of men fighting for their lives, the screams of horses wounded in the crossfire. The defenders were giving a good account of themselves, but Tom knew it was only a matter of time before superior numbers overwhelmed courage and determination. The signal fire platform was exactly as Father Miguel had described it. A stone circle, perhaps 10 feet across, filled with the remains of wood that had been gathered decades ago and never used. The wood was dry as bone, aged by sun and wind into perfect tinder that would burn hot and bright if he could get it started. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone rim, Apache and Pueblo markings that spoke of the platform's true age and purpose. Reminders that this place had been used for communication long before the Spanish came, long before the Americans arrived, long before the endless cycle of war and peace and war again that defined life on the frontier. Tom worked quickly, arranging the ancient wood into a proper fire lay, adding his kindling and oil to create the kind of blaze that would be visible for miles in every direction. The matches were precious. He had only 6, and if they failed, there would be no second chance for this desperate gamble. The wind was picking up, which would help the fire burn brighter, but made lighting it more difficult, requiring careful timing and a bit of luck that had been in short supply lately. The first match flared to life in his cupped hands, its flame seeming impossibly fragile against the vast darkness of the desert night and the howling wind that threatened to extinguish it before it could serve its purpose. Tom touched it to the oil-soaked kindling, watching as flames began to lick at the dry wood, growing stronger and brighter with each passing second as the fire found purchase and began to spread. Within minutes, the entire platform was ablaze, sending a column of flame and smoke high into the night sky, like a beacon calling across the endless wilderness. The fire was magnificent and terrible, a signal that could be seen for 50 miles in any direction, a message that something significant was happening in this forgotten corner of the world where most people came only to die or disappear. Tom stood beside his fire and looked out across the desert, wondering if anyone was watching, if anyone would understand what the signal meant, if anyone would care enough to investigate what was happening in a place that most maps didn't even bother to mark. The Apache were out there somewhere, moving through their ancestral territory like ghosts, seeing everything and being seen by nothing, masters of a land that had been theirs for countless generations before the first European ever set foot on the continent. If they noticed the fire, if they chose to investigate, if they decided that whatever was happening here was worth their attention and intervention, those were a lot of ifs to hang hope on. But Tom had learned long ago that hope was often all a man had when everything else failed and the world showed its true face. The gunfire below was intensifying, and Tom could see muzzle flashes lighting up the ruins of the village like deadly fireflies dancing among the shadows. He needed to get back to the defenders, to add his rifle to their desperate stand. But first, he fed more wood to the fire, ensuring that it would burn bright and long enough to serve its purpose, even if he died in the fighting below. The climb down was faster but more dangerous, loose stones and crumbling earth threatening to send him tumbling into the darkness with every step. Tom forced himself to be careful, knowing that a broken leg or twisted ankle would serve no one, but urgency drove him forward faster than caution would have preferred. The sound of battle was growing louder, more desperate, suggesting that the defenders were being pushed to their limits. He reached the village just as the first of Vasquez's men broke through the perimeter, a screaming bandit with a machete raised high, who died when Maria Santos put a bullet through his chest with a pistol shot that was steadier than her aged hands had any right to be. "Welcome back," Maria said dryly, as Tom took his position beside her, working the lever on his Winchester and scanning for targets. "Did you get your fire started?" "Burning like the gates of hell," Tom replied, taking aim at a bandit who was trying to flank their position through the ruins of what had once been the village bakery. "Now we just have to stay alive long enough to see if anyone noticed." The fight that followed was brutal and chaotic, a close-quarters battle that raged through the ruins of the village with the desperate intensity of people who knew they were fighting for their lives and the lives of everyone they held dear. Tom found himself moving constantly from position to position, trying to shore up weak points in their defenses, watching ammunition dwindle and fighters fall with the sick certainty that they were only delaying the inevitable. Carlos Mendoza, a boy of perhaps 16, who had been trying to act like a man since the fighting started, took a bullet in the shoulder and went down hard behind an overturned cart that served as one of their improvised barricades. Tom dragged him to safety, using his own shirt to bandage the wound, while bullets whined overhead like angry hornets seeking targets in the darkness. "Senor Callahan," Carlos gasped, his young face pale with shock and loss of blood. "Are we going to die here tonight?" Tom looked into the boy's eyes, seeing his own youth reflected there, remembering what it felt like to believe that courage and determination were enough to overcome any obstacle, any enemy, any impossible odds. "Maybe," he said honestly, because the boy deserved truth rather than comfortable lies. "But if we do, we'll die fighting for something that matters, protecting people who can't protect themselves. That has to count for something in the final accounting." An hour passed, then two, measured in the steady expenditure of ammunition and the gradual contraction of their defensive perimeter. The ammunition was almost gone now, reduced to counting individual bullets and making each shot count with the precision of men who understood that missing meant dying, and that dying meant abandoning the people who depended on them for protection. The defenders had been pushed back to the very center of the village, a tight circle of determined people surrounded by enemies who grew bolder with each passing minute as they sensed victory approaching. Tom could see Vasquez himself now, a tall man in silver-decorated clothing who directed the assault with the casual confidence of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of violence. Tom was down to his last 3 rounds when he heard it, a sound that made his blood turn to ice and his heart leap with impossible hope at the same time. It started as a whisper, barely audible above the sound of gunfire and shouting, then grew steadily louder until it filled the night air like the voice of the desert itself, given form and purpose. War cries. Apache war cries, dozens of them, hundreds of them, echoing off the canyon walls with the sound of death approaching on swift horses and bearing weapons that had been blessed by generations of warriors. It was a sound that had struck terror into the hearts of soldiers and settlers for decades, the battle cry of a people who had never been conquered and never learned to surrender. Vasquez's men heard it too, their confident advance faltering as they turned toward the sound with the sudden understanding that the battle they thought they were winning had just become something else entirely, something outside their experience and beyond their ability to control. The bandits were brave enough when facing farmers and shopkeepers, but the sound of Apache warriors in full war cry was enough to make seasoned fighters reconsider their life choices and wonder if there might be somewhere else they needed to be. They came out of the darkness like avenging angels, descending from heaven with swords of fire, 300 Apache warriors painted for war and mounted on horses that seemed to fly across the desert floor without touching the ground. They struck Vasquez's force like a hammer blow delivered by the gods themselves, scattering the bandits like leaves before a hurricane and turning what had been a massacre into a rout in the space of heartbeats. Tom watched in amazement as the Apache war party swept through the village with tactical precision that made it clear these were not random raiders, but disciplined warriors operating under unified command, with years of experience fighting against overwhelming odds. They moved like a pack of wolves, coordinating their attacks with hand signals and war cries, showing no mercy to men who had shown no mercy to others, extracting payment for crimes that cried out to heaven for vengeance. The bandit leader himself, Rodrigo Vasquez, tried to rally his men for a counterattack, standing in his stirrups and shouting orders that no one could hear above the chaos of battle and the thunder of Apache war horses. Tom had a clear shot, maybe his best chance to end this with a single well-placed bullet, but before he could squeeze the trigger, An Apache lance took Vasquez through the chest with the force of divine judgment, lifting him from his saddle and depositing him in the dust where he belonged. The battle was over almost before it had properly begun, a testament to the devastating effectiveness of Apache warfare when applied with strategic precision against an unprepared enemy. Those bandits who could escape fled into the desert on foot or horseback, leaving behind their dead and wounded and any pretense of victory, carrying with them stories that would make them unwelcome in cantinas from Sonora to Texas. The Apache warriors pursued the fleeing bandits just far enough to ensure they would not regroup and return, then rode back to the village to survey what they had preserved through their intervention. Tom found himself standing in the central plaza, surrounded by Apache warriors, whose painted faces reflected the flickering light of fires that still burned throughout the village, feeling like a man who had witnessed a miracle and lived to tell about it. The war chief who approached him was a man of perhaps 50 years, with scars that spoke of decades spent in battle and eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the truth that lay beneath surface appearances. His painted face was impressive and terrifying, but there was something in his manner that suggested intelligence and honor rather than simple savagery or bloodlust. "You lit the signal fire," the war chief said in careful English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command and the respect that came with proven leadership. "Yes," Tom replied, unsure whether this was an accusation that would lead to his death or simply a statement of fact that required acknowledgement. Why? The question was simple, but Tom understood that his answer would determine what happened next, not just to him, but to all the survivors who looked to him for leadership in this unprecedented situation. Because these people needed help, and you were the only ones close enough to provide it. The war chief studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in every detail of Tom's appearance and manner, reading signs that most men would never notice. Then he gestured toward the survivors who were emerging from their hiding places with the cautious hope of people who could not quite believe they were still alive and unharmed. "You trusted us to answer your call," the Apache said slowly, as if testing each word before speaking it. "Trusted us to come when you had no right to expect help, when our peoples have been enemies for generations, when most of your kind would rather die than owe their lives to Apache warriors. Why would you do such a thing?" Tom thought about the question, searching for an answer that would make sense to a man whose culture and experience were so different from his own, whose people had suffered at the hands of white soldiers and settlers for decades. Because sometimes enemies are just people who haven't found the right reason to be friends yet. And because desperate times require desperate measures, even when those measures seem impossible. The war chief smiled, the expression transforming his painted features in a way that was both surprising and encouraging, suggesting that perhaps this conversation would not end with Tom's scalp decorating an Apache lance. "I am Cochise," he said simply, as if the name explained everything that needed explaining. Tom felt his knees go weak with recognition and something approaching awe. Cochise, the legendary Apache leader whose very name had become synonymous with tactical brilliance and implacable resistance to white encroachment on tribal lands. The man who had held the entire Southwest in the grip of war for more than a decade, whose warriors were feared from Texas to California, whose reputation for honor was matched only by his reputation for devastating military effectiveness. "I know who you are," Tom managed, his voice barely steady. "I'm honored to meet you, though I never expected it would be under circumstances like these." Cochise nodded, his eyes taking in the devastation around them with the practiced assessment of a military commander who had seen too many battlefields and understood the true cost of violence. "These people, they fought well against impossible odds. There is honor in such courage, regardless of the color of one's skin or the language one speaks." As dawn broke over the village, painting the adobe walls in shades of gold and rose that made even the destruction look beautiful, the full extent of what had happened began to become clear. The Apache had not just driven off the bandits, they had annihilated them as a fighting force, ensuring that Vasquez's reign of terror was ended permanently and that other predators would think twice before targeting defenseless settlements. More than that, they had saved the lives of 37 people who had been prepared to die defending their homes, had preserved a community that might otherwise have become just another footnote in the long history of frontier violence. But perhaps most remarkably of all, they had answered the call of a desperate cowboy who had lit a signal fire in the darkness, trusting that ancient enemies might choose to become unexpected allies when the cause was just and the need was great. Cochise approached Tom as he stood beside the burned-out remains of the signal fire platform, the ashes still warm from the fire that had changed everything and everyone it touched. "You took a great risk," the Apache leader said, his voice thoughtful. "Lighting that fire could have brought anyone, soldiers, more bandits, people who would have made your situation worse instead of better." Tom nodded, understanding the truth of what Cochise was saying. "But it brought you instead. Why did you come? Why did you choose to help people who might have been your enemies under different circumstances?" Cochise was quiet for a moment, his eyes studying the village where Apache warriors were helping survivors tend to their wounded and begin the work of rebuilding what could be salvaged from the destruction. It was an unprecedented sight. Traditional enemies working together with the kind of cooperation that most people would have said was impossible. "Because the fire you lit was not just a call for help," he said finally, his words carrying the weight of deep consideration. "It was a signal of trust. You believed that we would answer, that we would choose to protect the innocent rather than exploit their weakness for our own gain. Such trust deserves to be honored, regardless of the history between our peoples." As the days passed following the battle, something unprecedented began to develop between the village and the Apache band. The warriors remained to help with the rebuilding, their presence ensuring that no other bandits would dare to threaten the settlement, while also providing labor and expertise that the villagers desperately needed. In return, the villagers shared what they had: food, medical supplies, and the kind of hospitality that transcended cultural boundaries and spoke to the fundamental humanity that connected all people regardless of their differences. Apache children and village children began playing together, their games requiring no translation and their laughter serving as a universal language that adults could understand even when they could not speak each other's tongues. Tom found himself serving as an unofficial ambassador between the two groups, translating not just languages but entire ways of thinking about honor and community and the obligations that came with strength. It was delicate work, requiring patience and sensitivity and a deep understanding of both cultures, but gradually trust began to develop between people who had been raised to see each other as natural enemies. The Apache warriors were fascinated by the villagers' knowledge of farming and construction, techniques that could supplement traditional hunting and gathering in times of scarcity. The villagers, in turn, learned about desert survival, plant medicine, and tracking skills that could mean the difference between life and death in the harsh environment of the Southwest. Father Miguel, who had survived the battle with a bullet wound in his arm, conducted the first joint ceremony between the two groups, a blessing that combined Christian and Apache elements in ways that would have scandalized church authorities, but seemed perfectly natural under the circumstances. "God works through all people," he explained to Tom, "and sometimes miracles come in forms we do not expect." Cochise and Tom spent long hours discussing the situation, both men recognizing that what was happening here could be the beginning of something much larger than either had imagined possible. The Apache leader was a pragmatist who understood that the old ways of constant warfare were becoming unsustainable as white settlement increased and military pressure mounted, while Tom had seen enough violence to appreciate the value of peace when it could be achieved honorably. "This alliance," Cochise said one evening, as they sat by a fire that had replaced the signal beacon, watching Apache and Mexican children play together in the plaza, It could serve both our peoples if we are wise enough to nurture it properly. Tom nodded, understanding the implications that stretched far beyond one small village in the desert. The territory is changing. More settlers coming every year, more pressure from the army and the territorial government. Maybe it's time to try something different than endless warfare. Partnership instead of war, Cochise mused, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered possibilities that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Protection instead of destruction. It would require trust from people who have learned that trust is dangerous. But the alternative is more of what we've always had, Tom pointed out. More bloodshed, more hatred, more children growing up thinking that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, or that all white men are enemies bent on destruction. Word of the unprecedented alliance began to spread across the territory like wildfire, carried by traders and travelers who could hardly believe what they had witnessed. Stories grew in the telling, as stories always did, but the essential truth remained. A desperate cowboy had lit a signal fire in the darkness, and 300 Apache warriors had answered with their lives, forging a bond that seemed to transcend the hatred and violence that had defined frontier relations for generations. Other Apache bands began sending delegations to see this miracle for themselves, drawn by curiosity and the possibility that perhaps there was another way forward besides endless war. Some came as skeptics, certain that cooperation with whites was either impossible or a betrayal of everything their people stood for. Others came with cautious hope, wondering if the alliance might offer solutions to problems that had seemed unsolvable through traditional means. The testing came when a cavalry patrol arrived at the village 6 weeks after the battle, drawn by reports of Apache activity in the area. Captain James Morrison led 20 troopers who expected to find either a burned-out settlement or evidence of recent massacre. Instead, they found Apache warriors and Mexican villagers working together to rebuild homes and improve defenses. The tension in that first confrontation was electric, with hands hovering near weapons and everyone uncertain how to proceed in a situation for which military manuals provided no guidance. Tom found himself once again serving as translator and mediator, explaining to the captain that the Apache had come as allies rather than enemies, that they had saved the village rather than destroyed it. "You're asking me to believe," Captain Morrison said slowly, his eyes taking in the unprecedented scene around him, "that Apache warriors responded to your signal fire by rescuing Mexican villagers from bandits, that they've been here for weeks, helping with reconstruction rather than planning attacks on other settlements." "I'm asking you to believe what you can see with your own eyes," Tom replied. "Sometimes the world surprises us by being better than we expected." The standoff that followed could have exploded into violence that would have destroyed everything that had been built. But Cochise chose that moment to approach with his hands visible and empty, speaking directly to the cavalry captain in English that was accented but clear. "I am Cochise," he said simply. "My warriors and I are guests here, welcomed by people who needed our help and trusted us to provide it. We have harmed no one except bandits who preyed on the innocent." Captain Morrison's hand had moved instinctively toward his sidearm when Cochise approached, but something in the Apache leader's manner made him pause. This was not the savage warrior of popular imagination, but a leader speaking with dignity and authority, someone who commanded respect, regardless of the color of his skin. "Sir," Morrison said finally, his military training overriding his personal prejudices, "I have orders to investigate reports of Apache raiding in this area. What I see here doesn't match any of the reports I received." "Because what happened here was not raiding," Tom interjected. "It was rescue. These people were dying, and Cochise's warriors saved them. Everything since then has been about building something better than what came before." The conversation that followed was delicate and complex, with misunderstandings threatening to derail progress at every turn. But gradually, through patient explanation and careful diplomacy, The truth of the situation became clear, even to skeptical soldiers who had been taught to see all Apache as enemies. Captain Morrison was a career officer who understood that his report would be read by territorial officials who might not appreciate the nuances of the situation, but he was also a man who could recognize honor when he saw it, regardless of its source. "I'll report what I've observed here," he said finally, "but I strongly recommend that this arrangement be formalized through proper channels. What you've accomplished is remarkable, but it needs official recognition to survive." And so began the slow process of transforming an emergency alliance into something more permanent and sustainable. Tom found himself traveling to territorial capitals and army posts, explaining the situation to officials who ranged from fascinated to horrified by the implications of what had happened at San Miguel. Some saw opportunity in the alliance, recognizing that peaceful cooperation might accomplish more than military force in bringing stability to the frontier. Others saw only dangerous precedent, worrying that successful Apache settler cooperation might encourage other tribes to demand similar arrangements rather than accepting reservation life. But the alliance held and grew stronger, tested by skeptics and enemies, but sustained by the simple truth that it worked better than the alternatives. The signal fire that Tom had lit in Desperation had become a beacon of hope for people throughout the territory who were tired of endless violence and ready to try something different. Years later, when peace finally came to the Southwest through a complex series of treaties and agreements, historians would note the role played by the village of San Miguel and the unlikely alliance that had been forged there. Some would call it a miracle, while others would insist it was simply the inevitable result of reasonable people choosing cooperation over conflict when given the chance. But the Apache remembered it differently, and their memory was longer and more accurate than written history. In their oral tradition, the story became legend, the tale of a cowboy who lit a signal fire in the darkness and trusted that ancient enemies would choose to become allies when justice called and innocent lives hung in the balance. They spoke of Tom Callahan, the man who had risked everything on the hope that people could be better than their prejudices, and of the night when 300 warriors had answered his call with their lives, proving that courage and honor transcended the artificial boundaries that politicians and generals drew on maps. The signal fire platform was rebuilt and maintained, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of peace and the possibility of cooperation between different peoples. On special occasions, fires were lit there to commemorate the night when desperation had become hope, when enemies had become friends, when one man's courage had changed the course of history for an entire region. And sometimes, on clear desert nights when the wind was right and the stars were bright, children of the village would claim they could still see the ghost of that original fire, burning eternal in the darkness, as a reminder that even in the darkest hours, there was always hope for those brave enough to light a signal and trust that someone, somewhere, would answer the call. The tribe had answered with 300 strong, but more than that, they had answered with their hearts, proving that the bonds of humanity were stronger than the boundaries that men drew on maps and in their minds. It was a lesson that would outlive them all, carried forward in the stories and songs of a people who had learned that sometimes the greatest victories were won not with weapons, but with the courage to trust in the goodness of others. Tom Callahan lived to see the full flowering of what he had started with a signal fire lit in Desperation. He watched as the alliance between San Miguel and Cochise's band became a model for other settlements, as trade replaced raiding, as children who might have grown up as enemies instead learned to see each other as neighbors and friends. He never left the village, finding in its rebuilt streets and thriving community a sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded him throughout his wandering years. When he died, an old man surrounded by friends from two cultures, his funeral was attended by Apache warriors and Mexican farmers alike, all united in their respect for the man who had lit a fire in the darkness and changed their world forever. The signal fire platform still stands, a monument to the power of trust and the possibility of peace between peoples who have every reason to be enemies. And on quiet nights, when the wind carries the scent of sage across the desert and the stars shine with ancient light, some say you can still see that first fire burning, eternal and bright, a beacon calling across the darkness to all who have the courage to answer.